Terima kasih. Kita mulakan. Good morning, everyone. It's Swee King again, and it's a pleasure to see all of you today. Today, we're going to be talking about health policies. But per my email to everyone yesterday, I'm very sorry that we'll only be able to do this for 1 hour today. But I'll make it up to you next week, and we'll spend 2 hours together as we talk about global health and a little bit about health policies as well. Yeah. So I've also sent the slides to everyone yesterday. So there will be some small changes to the slides. So let's focus on what we have on the screen right now instead of the slides that have been sent to you yesterday. I've received some interesting comments as well as some suggestions from all of you yesterday, over the last 1 week about how we can do this lecture series differently. So some of your ideas I've already incorporated. So I want to say thank you for these ideas. All right, we'll get going here. The first slide is a gentle reminder, as usual, that the science and the arts are very different creatures and different branches of knowledge, and therefore you will need to have different skill sets in order to learn the arts as well. And today, more than last week, we will learn a lot more of the arts of policy making rather than the science of policy making. Yes, last week we studied about systems, and systems are very rigid and compartmentalized, but policy making is very broad and also very subjective, dependent on a lot of variables, and therefore we must be very comfortable with something that's a little less structured than what we are used to. As always, I will stop after a few slides and I will look at the chat group. If you have any questions, put them in the chat group and I'll get to them. There will be some time for questions and answers just before we end as well. All right, that's the first slide about the reminder of science and arts. Now, let's go for a quiz, okay? Now, let's go for a quiz by first asking you the question that you should answer in the chat group, yeah? So just answer A, B, or C in the chat group. The first question I have for you is, who should make health policies for Malaysia? Should it be politicians or technocrats in HQ? I mean, Putrajaya or state capitals like Kuala Terengganu and Kota Baru, or the frontliners who are implementing these policies? Who should make health policies for Malaysia? And remember, there are no right and wrong answers. Please answer in the chat group. I would love to hear your thoughts. In the chat group, type your answers A, B, or C. The answer is should, yeah, but not currently making health policies for Malaysia. So in your subjective opinion, siapa yang patut, who should make the health policies for Malaysia, whatever health policies mean, yeah? I see some really interesting answers, things like A after listening to C, A and C. A lot of people are answering B. Very good. Okay, good. Well, the answer of who should make health policies for Malaysia, it's unfortunately all three. So I find it very difficult to give an answer to this one. So therefore, let us move on to the second question for everyone, okay? And we will explore question number one a lot more as we go through the slides. Now, question number two is, how many laws regulate the health sector in Malaysia? And when I say laws, I mean Undang-Undang Malaysia, things that were passed by the Parliament of Malaysia or even the state legislatures of Malaysia. Now, let's answer question two. How many laws regulate the health sector in Malaysia? Is it approximately 5? Is it approximately 10? Is it approximately 25? Go ahead and answer question two. Okay, I'll give it another 10 seconds. The question is, how many laws regulate the health sector in Malaysia? The answer is at least 25, and there could be more. And we'll look at some of these laws in the next slides, yeah? So you can see that as a medical student, you're also concerned about studying science, and you should be. But there are 25 laws that regulate the practice of health in Malaysia. And we don't really study that for very good reasons, because we're not lawyers, this is not our subject matter expertise, and so on and so forth. The point I'm making is there are so many laws that regulate the health sector in Malaysia, and laws are only one type of a health policy? Let's go to the third question, okay? Now, as Prime Minister, now you're Prime Minister again. So if you are Prime Minister, you want more laws, or you want fewer laws, or you want smarter laws? What a loaded question. Of course, everybody will answer fewer or smarter. What a loaded question. But there will be some consequences, and we'll discuss those consequences in a short while about what are the challenges, yeah, of creating a smarter law. So again, I don't think I put an answer here, or I did actually, but maybe an answer will be fewer. But there are also problems. Remember last week we spoke a little bit about unintended consequences. Today we'll talk about that a little bit more. If you have more laws or fewer laws or even smarter laws, all three solutions or all three approaches that you will have problems in and of themselves. So they have unintended consequences if you have more, less, or smart, even if you have smarter laws as well. We'll explore some of these unintended consequences later. All right, now, ladies and gentlemen, and my friends and colleagues, let me show you here at the moment. These are the laws regulating health in Malaysia. I will not read through all of them, but I've divided them into a few components, my classifications, yeah, not classifications by the Malaysian government. And this list is also not exhaustive. The first group of laws in blue are the professional entry requirements to be a doctor, a dentist, a nurse, a pharmacist, an optician, an allied health professional. Also, to enter medical school or to create a private medical school, you need professional entry requirements. To become a doctor, you need Employment Act and the Sabah and Sarawak labor ordinances and so on for you to be employed. But remember, last week, we spoke about health being different from healthcare. Now, employment doesn't only mean your employment as doctors, but we should also talk about the employment for people who work in factories, people, migrant workers or refugees who may be given the right to work, or farmers and fishermen, people who work in offices. There are various occupational health, employment standards, for example, that needs to be kept. We don't want people to go to a factory that is unsafe and they breathe air that is polluted, worsening their asthma, or they get their hands at risk, right, of amputations because they've been working a machine that is unsafe. You can never build enough emergency departments and train enough orthopedic surgeons to manage cases of asthma and workplace accidents as a result of unsafe working conditions. I repeat, if your factories are unsafe, you should fix those factories instead of building more hospitals to fix the problems that come from unsafe factories. That's why we have employment laws that regulate health in Malaysia. When you become a doctor, the third group of laws that regulate health in Malaysia are the Clinical Practice of Health Acts. For example, the Private Healthcare Facilities and Services Act, or PHFSA 1998, is designed to regulate private clinics, private hospitals, and also anybody working in the private sector, for example, physiotherapists, technicians, doctors. We have the Dangerous Drugs Act. So when you prescribe morphine, for example, for somebody who has cancer pain, it's coming under the Dangerous Drugs Act. The Medical Devices Act covers things like stents that you put into somebody with heart disease, or the prosthetic devices for orthopedics, or the implantable cardioverter defibrillators that you put for somebody who's got arrhythmias. Companies like Pfizer or Roche or GSK must go under the Medicines Advertisement and Sales Act, including supplements as well, which come under the Medicines Act or even the Food Act. The Fees Act determines how much you pay in the government sector and the private sector. These days, during COVID, we have the Prevention and Control of Infectious Diseases Act and its regulations. And since 2007, we've had the Pathology Laboratory Act, which regulates companies like Gribbles and PathLab and BP Lab, generally trying to prevent or regulate their standards and increase their standards to prevent say no oversight from doctors, meaning previously, before this act in 2007 for pathology laboratories, Gribbles, BP, PathLab, for example, didn't need doctors. They can just operate by themselves. Number two, any public person can just go to these labs and request a test without going through a doctor, and those are dangerous, also inappropriately wasteful. Thirdly, before the Pathology Laboratory Act, if you are a BOMO or a SINSE or any traditional medicine person, you can technically prescribe or ask for an investigation and ask the patient to go to a Gribbels or a Path lab. So these are examples of the Clinical Practice of Health Acts. We also have interesting laws that regulate the facility services and standards. The Personal Data Protection Act is important because when you go to a private hospital, you're giving your data, including your, for example, sensitive data like HIV status. Are you pregnant or not pregnant? What genetic conditions do you have? And we want to protect you as in the patient, from other people accessing this information and abusing it. That's why we have the PDPA. The Atomic Energy Licensing Act is necessary for radiologists. So if you have an MRI or a CT scan or a PET scan, or you use radioisotopes like radioactive iodine to treat people with goiter, for example, then it comes under the purview of the Atomic Energy Licensing Act, which comes under the Atomic Energy Department, which comes under the Department of Environment, which is under the Ministry of Science. One very beautiful example of how there are many laws that regulate health in Malaysia, but they're outside the Ministry of Health. Other laws would be the Telemedicine Act, for telemedical services, Insurance Act, which is administered by Bank Negara Malaysia, not the Ministry of Health, and it regulates the insurance industry in Malaysia, and also the local government regulations as well. One second here. All right. Now, I will say also that there are various actors over here, that the Ministries of Health, Higher Education, Science and Environment, Energy and Local Government and Agriculture are the different actors that regulate health in Malaysia. There are other agencies like SIRIM and DOSH and DOE. DOSH is Department for Occupational Safety and Health, DOE is Department of Environment, NQA is Malaysian Qualifications Agency that maintains the standards of private universities and medical schools. And these are examples of agencies. We've got councils and boards like Malaysian Medical Council, Pharmacy Board, Dental Council, Nurses Board, and the Midwife Board. We also have the state and local governments that regulate health as well. Wow. I've spent just 5 minutes telling you about this entire landscape of laws regulating health in Malaysia. One fun observation is that this list is not even exhaustive. Let's move to the next slide. In the next slide, I'll need to give you some definitions, yeah? But I do apologize, my friends and colleagues, but I'm receiving a call from the Putrajaya Health Office, and this is regarding COVID. So if you'll excuse me, I need to take this call for 3 minutes, and I'll put you on silent. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, I'm back. But I do apologize, but let me check. Cik Syamsul, boleh dengar saya balik ke?
Yep, kita dengar loud and clear.
Okay, terima kasih. Well, I'll tell you who called me. The person who called me was from Pejabat Kesihatan Daerah in Putrajaya, and they're doing surveillance for COVID because we've had some cases in the apartment building that I'm staying in right now, including unfortunately, the Novgorod cluster started from my apartment building. So PKD Putrajaya has been calling for surveillance purposes, and this is how the system is working. So I'm very pleased that I could interact with my colleague in PKD Putrajaya, and they are keeping the country safe. So thank you very much for bearing with me, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very sorry for the interruption. Let me go back to the slide, yeah? And to go back to the slide is to say the constitution of, we'll start with some definitions, yeah? And these are some definitions that you take some time to read and to understand. So I'll go fast, but you may have to go back and read the slides again. We begin with the Constitution of Malaysia, the highest possible document in Malaysia that governs the way we operate our country. In Constitution of Malaysia, there is the 9th schedule. In the 9th schedule, there are 3 lists. The list of responsibilities for the federal government or the federal list, the list of responsibilities for the state government or the state list, and the third list is the concurrent list, meaning it's both the responsibility of the federal and the state. Example, federal responsible for national security, state responsible for land and Islamic affairs. Concurrent list has got a few items that is the joint responsibility of federal and state. Example, health. Public health, sanitation, and the prevention of diseases is both in federal and state. Therefore, it's the responsibility of federal government and the state government for health. One example would be in recent days, the Selangor state government has announced that there will be a ban on smoking in public parks. And this is stricter than any federal government legislation. Where do they get their power? The punca kuasa, yeah? The word punca kuasa is important whenever you're making health policies. That comes from the Constitution of Malaysia. Let's go a little bit to laws, and this requires us to understand the legal system a little bit. What is a bill? It's a proposal to Parliament or state legislature or Dewan Undangan Negeri. It's not yet approved. An act is approved by the federal government. An enactment is approved by state legislature or Dewan Undangan Negeri, and an ordinance is approved by the Sarawak state only. So in Kelantan and Kedah and Johor, it's called an enactment. In Parliament Malaysia, it's called an Akta or Act. In Sarawak, only Sarawak is called an ordinance for historical reasons. It's not called an enactment. But under each of these acts or enactments or ordinances, there is something called the subsidiary legislation. And these are called rules, regulations, orders, or bylaws. As one example, the Prevention of Control and Infectious Diseases Act is passed in Parliament, but it has regulations on MCO, and the quarantine centers, yeah, which government facilities will be approved quarantine centers. And these regulations are passed or approved by the Minister of Health, not by Parliament. Why? Because it's faster, easier, and also more responsive. If the MCO changes, for example, we had MCO then extended every 2 weeks, and now we're in recovery MCO, and soon we'll be in I can't even recall right now, but conditional MCO and then recovery MCO. And after the 31st of August, we'll have a third category, normalization MCO is the name. It changes so rapidly that we cannot keep going back to Parliament. So it's easier, faster, and more responsive if there are regulations that are under the acts, so that the Minister or the Director General of Health will be able to tweak very quickly. Now, that's the Constitution of Malaysia. These are the example of laws and the names, but what's the difference between a public policy and a law? The short answer is law is small and public policy is much larger. So a law is a subset of a much larger group of public policies. Public policies encompass, in the second bullet point, a set of activities by government to change economy and society. It means everything and nothing. So let me give as alternative definition. It's a law, a regulation, a procedure, administrative action, incentive, or voluntary practice of governments and other institutions. So therefore, laws are only one type of activity to change economy and society. Repeat, it's only one type of activity to change economy and society. You want to change economy and society, you can do other things like education, which is not a law, awareness programs, which is not a law, interest rate changes by Bank Negara. The governor of Bank Negara, a lady I admire very much, Dr. Nur Samsia, she's recently reduced the interest rates in Malaysia. That is not a law. It's a policy change. What is also not a law is Rancangan Malaysia ke-12, 13, 14, and so on and so forth. The annual federal budget is also not a law. Salary incentives, for example, giving a cost of living allowance for contract doctors, that is not a law. Actions by civil society and individuals are also not laws. Laws are important, but they are only one type of activity to change economy and society. There's this entire universe of other activities to change economics and society. But one historical fact, which I love, is that laws are much, much older. A long time ago, when I say a long time ago, I'm thinking in Athens or the advent of democracy at that time, or the founding of the American Republic in 1776, we created a whole bunch of laws. But public policies came later, around 1910s, 1950s or so, in the 20th century, because governments got better, more organized and more professional, also larger. And when the civil service becomes larger and more professional, they realize that you cannot only rely on laws. You must also have this entire non-law sets of activities like education, awareness, interest rates, changes, Rancangan Malaysia ke-12, federal budget, salary incentives, and so on, to change society and economy. And that's essentially what health policy is, right? Health policy are policies, instruments of law or education or awareness that increase the health of a population. So if you only think of health policies in narrow terms, make a law all the time, just make a law. We already have 25 over laws and you want to make more laws, then we're missing the opportunity to create this entire universe of other policy instruments to improve the health of society. Let me move on to the next slide. This is a very busy slide. I'm not going to go through the details of it. It tries to answer the question, who makes what policies, where and when? Who, what, where, and when? All trying to answer the question in one slide. And therefore, you know that this slide will be high level. It cannot be exhaustive. I'm trying to give you a sense of who makes what policies, where, and when. Now, we'll begin with the column and we'll go down like this, okay? So in the first column, who are elected politicians, people from either Perikatan Nasional or Pakatan Harapan, elected politicians from the various political parties. We've got elected or appointed politicians or leaders in state, district, and municipal. So in state is elected. In district, it is usually appointed. And the district officer or pegawai daerah, it's a relic of the British times, actually, when they had district officers. It's a cross between elected and appointed. Oh, that's not true. They're not elected. There's no elections. But they're appointed. They can be considered a neutral term of a leader, but often they're also politicians because they used to belong to a political party here and there. There are some states in Malaysia, for example, Sabah and Sarawak, that directly appoint, not elect, yeah? So not undi, but rather melantik. They appoint politicians to become a state exco, like Sabah and Sarawak, but in Peninsula, they don't have appointments to state exco, only elections. That's why I put elected/appointed. We also have government technocrats, government administrators or government bureaucrats, and here I mean the Secretary General of Health or the Director General of Health, Deputy Director of Communicable Diseases, and so on and so forth. We have semi-government. The word semi-government, I'll use air quotes, and there will be examples of organizations like EPF or KWSP, SOCSO or Perkeso, and Khazanah Nasional. And there are also non-government people who make policies as well, and they'll exist in all levels. So now, having understood the people, the next one I might ask you to look at is the third column. Where do they sit? And these are institutions that you're already aware of. They sit in Parliament. They are also, as members of Parliament, sometimes they're ministers of health or education or environment. And in the state level, they're the state Dewan Undangan Negeri, or sometimes they're the state exco, or they belong in the state government or the district office, or local councils like Majlis Perbandaran Ampang Jaya or Majlis Perbandaran Kota Baru, or so on and so forth. If they're a government technocrat, they're sit at all levels like JPA or Perkhidmatan Awam, from the Director General all the way to the District Health Officer at all levels. And another example would be the MMC chairperson or Malaysian Medical Council chairperson, and so on and so forth. And these are where they sit. What type of policies do they make are over here, and when do they make them are over here in the final column as well. I prefer not to go through this table exhaustively with you, yeah? And this is meant to be indicative, a little bit of a non-exhaustive list of who makes what health policies where and when, just so you have the idea of the universe. And this universe isn't always complete, because there will be other health policies or healthcare policies that are made outside of the weekly cabinet meetings or the annual budget or the 5-yearly Rancangan Malaysia. There will be some things that are outside this calendar that I've put to you over here. You can see here that the landscape of health policies, right? It's not as simple as Putrajaya Ministry of Health makes health policies. And you can see that there are so many levels of people who make health policies, sometimes really big ones, sometimes very small and targeted ones. But I'm not here to tell you which ones are big or which ones are small or which ones are important or less important. I'm here to tell you at the moment that the universe of health policy making is very large, and they exist at very many levels and many different departments as well. And if you think of it as a senior to junior perspective, also a multiple departments perspective, you can see that the landscape is very large. And one big problem with this large landscape is the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. And you have the problem of silos. No, it's not really their fault. You know, the system is so large that you can't really expect that, say, an elected politician in the federal government will know everything that EPF is doing, or the district health officer will know everything that the education department is doing. And these things require us to have, say, good communication channels, a smaller government, and things like that. Subjects for longer conversations about how to administer a large government. Let me move on to my next slide. And I think I've got just a couple more slides. So this is the second last one. Then the question is now, how are health policies made? In the previous slide, who makes what policies, where and when? Now we're answering the how. The why is clear. The why is to improve the population's health. That's easy. But how are health policies made is the question that we'll answer in this slide. I'll begin with this image over here. And the image over here is you begin with a problem identification. It's quite intuitive. I will not spend too much time over on this image. It comes from the Center of Disease Control, and I provided a link to you at the bottom over here on the left. Intuitively, you start with identifying the problem. And then you analyze the policy, including the different options that's available to you. You develop your strategy, thirdly, and the policy develop and develop the policy. You enact, or in this case, you implement the put the policy into law. Finally, you implement this. But this is a circular fashion, because once you fix the problem, you may find that from identifying the problem to implementing a solution could take years. Because if it's a big problem and it's been there for 50 years, you cannot snap your finger and everything will just magically fix itself. It takes a very long time to make a policy, very long time to put it into law, and a very long time to implement this. Should this be faster? Yes. Do I think it can be faster? Yes. If you put me in charge, maybe we'll try to make it a little faster. But then again, the point I'm making is that even with the best of intentions and with the strongest group of policymakers in front of you, the decision process will still be a very slow one. And I'll prove it to you in 2 slides from now. But on the left, yeah, in this image over here, quite intuitive. Identify the problem, analyze the policy, develop the strategy and the policy, put it into law or some sort of implementation, say punca kuasa, implement it, and then you identify a new problem and a circle begins. It doesn't, and let me move on to the text, yeah, on the right-hand side of the screen. This is a text that I've come up with. In my experience, I'd like to divide this into theory and reality. How are health policies made in theory? Use knowledge, use evidence, and use judgment. Knowledge comes from your knowledge and understanding about health and systems. For example, how many people pay what, and what's the system for collecting taxes and so on. Knowledge of political science, law, economics, history, everything is important in making health policies in terms of knowledge. But knowledge is not enough. You need evidence from randomized controlled trials or statistics or data and best practices from countries like Japan or Taiwan or South Korea who've reformed their health systems over the years. However, just like in medicine, perfect knowledge and perfect evidence does not exist. Repeat, does not exist. Meaning you can never run randomized controlled trials that tell you everything there is to know about the world. You're trying to answer the question, what is truth? Apakah itu kebenaran? And that is impossible to answer by human beings who are imperfect. Now, I want to repeat again that there's no such thing as perfect knowledge and evidence. And if you wait endlessly to get perfect knowledge or more evidence, then the policies will never take place and people will continue to suffer. You need a balance between just enough knowledge and evidence, and then you apply the third thing, judgment, which is data analysis, interpretation, extrapolation of data, also your own sense of judgment. And this is something the Malay word for it, akal, is something that I like very much and appreciate very much. And this is something not easy for people to accept, because as scientists, we are trained that we need to have knowledge and evidence, and that is true. I'm not saying don't have it. The reality is you will never be able to get all the knowledge in the world, which is why I make a joke to you. Every study that has been published in the history of studies in every discipline will have in the final paragraph of all those studies, the sentence, more research is needed. I guarantee you, every study has a sentence, more research is needed. It's true, more research is needed, but it's a moving target you will never be able to end. Therefore, your judgment becomes important, which is not to say don't acquire knowledge, which is not to say don't find evidence. Acquire knowledge, find evidence, and then apply your judgment. That's in theory how health policies are made. But in reality, I give you the term in red, desirable meets feasible. If you want to make a health policy, you have to balance in reality between what's desirable and what's aspirational versus what's feasible and what can be implemented. Let me explain. The aspiration part is the question of where does government want to lead society? Then you will say beautiful rhetoric, and I would love your rhetoric, like world peace, no hunger, everybody equal, no racism, everybody healthy. I love that. And there are good questions there about how do we improve the human condition and how do we change the world. Unfortunately, the reality is that all governments have limited resources. Time is one thing, money is another, organizational energy. What I mean is the Ministry of Health has 270,000 people, but you can't expect the Ministry of Health in Malaysia to do everything all at once and to save the entire system in 6 months. That kind of organizational energy is very limited, and we must very carefully think about how we want to, say, achieve changes in the world. And finally, there's also the issue of governments having limited political capital, especially in the current situation of the government of Malaysia, where the government has a very slim majority at the moment inside the parliament. They must consider what are the health policies or even the entire set of government and public policies that they want to pursue. One drastic example here, I don't, okay, maybe not, let me not use the word drastic, okay? I'll give you one example. The example is a court, the High Court in India, a few years ago, declared, the High Court judges issued a ruling saying you shall not pollute the Yamuna River. That's it. That was just a ruling. But I can issue that ruling and I can say we must have world peace and we must have zero poverty and things like that. The issue is always the implementation of the policies that you want, the laws that you want, the education programs that you want, the structural changes that you want, and so on. The problems have always been in the implementation rather than the writing of the policies. The principles are easy for all of us to understand, you and I, and we can articulate these principles very well. The challenge, like I say, is always deciding what's feasible and then trying to implement what's feasible. Of course, there are two schools of thought. One school of thought will say we must have policies that are very transformational and we must revolutionize everything today. And that's a revolution approach. The second school of thought will be the evolution approach. One is revolutionize everything. The other is let it evolve slowly because we understand that change cannot happen overnight. We must be slow and patient. Some things must take time and so on. I think both are right at the same time. And this requires your judgment, your knowledge, and your evidence. The health system is so large that some parts of the health system can be dramatically transformed or necessary to be dramatically transformed. And some parts of the health system, even though you need to dramatically transform, it is impossible to dramatically transform. And I'm giving you a bit of a reality on the ground and the theory of it, how a health policy is made. You can look at the CDC link over here. You can read some articles that sketch out how a health policy is made. But those are beautiful articles written by academics, right? Frequently university professors, frequently people who have never really worked in government, have never really gotten their, say, hands dirty in making health policies, and they've not been in a position where they have to trade off and understand you only have 1 million ringgit and you must choose A or B. You cannot choose A and B. And these kind of situations are very complex real-life situations, and I present to you the theory and the reality of how health policies are made. Let me move on to, I think this is the final slide. Okay, maybe not. I would like to give you a case study. And in this case study, I'll explain a bit of the case study. And next week, I would love to hear 1 or 2 or 3 of you tell me about your case study about how to make an actual health policy. I've given you enough of an idea for how to make health policies in terms of using knowledge, evidence, as well as your own personal judgment, balancing between what's aspirational and what's feasible. How do you know what's aspirational and feasible? You have to be in the situation. So as I ask you to do this case study, you will then answer in form of questions like, yeah, I want to collect evidence A, B, and C. You don't have to tell me what those evidences are, but you just want to say, I want to know the total number of specialists in Malaysia right now. What's the percentage of public sector versus private sector? And you want to know how many of them are specialists who are more than 10 years qualified and less than 10 years qualified, for example. You want to know these data points so that you'll be able to make an informed decision. Just like in medicine, before you make a diagnosis for the patient or prescribe a treatment plan, you have to have the evidence. I'd like you to consider this case study, which I'm giving to you right now in this slide. Let me give the case study to you. But it's in terms of this flow that I like to call PSPI, or Principles to Strategies to Policies and Implementation. Now, I will begin here, right, in the box in red at the bottom, yeah? Often, we find a problem and we immediately react and say, we must have a policy. I instinctively know what's the right policy. Often that's what happens to us. The problem right now, for example, is, I may invite you to think about this, is recently the health minister has announced that if you want to specialize and you're a contract doctor and you're just 2 or 3 years of a service in Malaysia, you can pay your own way. The government will not be able to pay for you or does not want to pay for you. I'm not sure which one, but the government will not pay for you. And obviously this is a problem. And when the problem comes out, our first instinct is to say, these are the policies, these are the solutions, this is what needs to be done. I strongly disagree with this approach. It's too reactive and it's not methodical enough, and we're not addressing the root causes of the issues. We're not thinking through the process too deeply enough, yeah? So what I'd like you to consider is thinking about the principles, the strategies, the policies, and the implementation. Let me explain this to you. Look at the box in green at the bottom, yeah? You find a problem, you think of the root causes, and you think of the principles, and then the strategies, policies, and then you implement, monitor, and evaluate, and you watch for unintended consequences. And that's a bit of a policy flow, how to make a public policy or how to make a health policy. In the first row on the top in this table over here, what I've done is to give you the definition of what's a principle, which is a fundamental belief. A strategy is a long-term plan with a set of policies and laws and activities. That's your strategy, how to win the war. The policies are a subset of the strategies. And the subset of the strategies are then used to achieve the overall strategy. And finally, you have to consider how to implement these policies, but implementation is not enough. You must consider how to monitor and evaluate these policies as well. Now, monitoring and evaluation is a very rich subject matter in total, right? So I will not say perform this lecture to you. The point I'm saying is that the implementation component, I think, is crucial. Now, I'll give two examples, and then it's your turn, yeah? The first principle is health should be everyone's responsibility, not solely the government's responsibility. If you believe in this principle, it will inform your strategy, which is then the 10-year plan to change the taxation system to increase the user fees, for example, 1 ringgit and 5 ringgit that we pay for government hospitals. And you also educate the citizens on their personal responsibility for health. That's the strategy. The strategy is to change the system, increase user fees, and educate personal responsibility for health, because your principle is health is everyone's responsibility, not just the government. And your policies would be study the feasibility of increasing user fees, and then you do a research and you ask people, you develop a plan to increase, and then you communicate. It could be that you start with a pilot in primary care clinics, and then you move on to secondary hospitals, and you do, for example, one state at a time, instead of flip the switch from the 1st of August, all countries, the whole country, all facilities will increase their user fees. So you don't do it like that, you know. So the point I'm making is you must have a principle before that informs and underpins your strategy, which helps you develop the policies, and then you think through the implementation. Let me give you another example, which is about the specialist training that I spoke about just now. If your principle is the government must support the training of specialists as a public good, if that's your principle, then it informs your 5-year strategy to rationalize the contract system and accelerate the specialist training program, which then gives you the policy of reducing the number of medical schools, which then has the implementation of MQA to audit and close failing medical schools. I know it seems very intuitive, that if you have a principle, it tells you your strategy, it gives you your policies, and then the implementation. This is very good if it's intuitive. The main point I'm making is you don't have to compartmentalize it like that. Of principles, strategies, policies, implementation, that's not necessary for you to compartmentalize. But I would like you to have a flow, not problem, reaction, problem, reaction, problem, reaction. This is poor policy making, because everything you do has unintended consequences. I've made a comment here about monitoring and evaluation, and there is a link over here, and I invite you to look at the link. You don't have to memorize it or understand it, but know that this field of study of monitoring and evaluating public policy exists. And if you ask me, how do I know what's a good public policy? The answer is look at monitoring and evaluation. I don't want to talk to you about monitoring and evaluation anymore. I want to talk to you about a new thing of unintended consequences. The unintended consequences, for example, here, in example number 2, the government must support the training of specialists as a public good. True, let's agree to this statement, but are there unintended consequences? The answer is yes, there are unintended consequences. I can think of 2 unintended consequences. Number 1, if the government supports the training of specialists as a public good, then everybody becomes reliant on the government. And if government is not good or not competent or corrupt or inefficient for whatever reason, then the entire public education system and public health system will collapse. So while it's true that government must support the training, if we're overly reliant on government, then if the government's not good, whatever good means, then the system will collapse. And that is an unintended consequence. It is better perhaps for us to be self-reliant as well. The second unintended consequence of the government supporting the training of specialists, right, is that if you want the government to support the training of specialists, it means that the government will have to do human resources planning. They will then say, this year we have 12,000 specialists, we need 15,000, we're going to get there. And it imposes a quota, imposes a strict rules of entry, and that would be not beneficial to you as well if you're thinking about training to be a specialist. Now, this is not saying that I don't believe government should support. On balance, government should support. What I'm saying is, even though you believe that your policy will be good, and it will save humanity and it will be ethical and moral and legal, there will almost always be unintended consequences of any policy that you make. Therefore, we need to watch for unintended consequences of these policies as well. Ladies and gentlemen, what I've done for you is to give you a bit of a flow of thinking of how to make a health policy or a public policy. You can look, let's look at the ones at the bottom in red, yeah? Sorry, in green, sorry. You find a problem, you think of the causes, and then you look at principles. What are the principles that anchor you? And I've given two examples over here. What are the strategies, like 1 year, 5 year, 3 years, you decide. What are the policies, 2 or 3 policies, or it could be 50 policies that's necessary to achieve this strategy. And finally, the implementation, monitoring, evaluation, and watching for unintended consequences. It is not as simple as find a problem, fix the problem with the solution. It needs to be a little bit more deliberate than that. Ladies and gentlemen, we've got about 10 more minutes. I'm going to give you some bad news. The bad news is in practical reality, policies are very slow. They are very difficult. They're often captured by vested interests. The process is not transparent. And I'll explain all this, right, by giving the example of the PathLab Act in a while. The process is not transparent, so we often don't know what's inside the government policy-making process. Sometimes it's intentionally not transparent, sometimes it's unintentionally not transparent, because the government can't tell you everything. It's just a fact of life. You want it to tell you most things, yes, but even if they want to tell you most things, they simply cannot for logistical reasons. I mean, so many meetings are had in government offices every day. They can't give you the meeting minutes. It's just impossible to do so, logistically and technologically speaking. And then with top-down policy making, meaning top-down policy making from Putrajaya or bottom-up policy making from people in the district health office, both of them have got pros and cons. Policy making in the public's view often look for a single magic solution. They want one solution, magically fix everything overnight, and no such a single magic solution exists. Implementation is crucial, obviously, more than a policy making, but dependent on too many variables. This is the practical reality of policy making in many countries, and any country rather. Let me give the example of the Pathology Lab Act. Policies are slow and difficult to make. In 1983 was the first memorandum. In 2007, the bill was tabled and passed. So this took it's 24 years before from the memorandum to the passing of the act. Policies are slow and very difficult to make. They are captured by vested interests. So when I explained to you the Pathology Laboratory Act earlier, who do you think might be the vested interest to prevent the Pathology Laboratory Act from coming in? And those who are losing as a result of the policy will obviously oppose the policy. This is just a fact of life, and therefore they could be captured by vested interests. The process is not transparent. So at multiple points between 1983 and 2007, we will not be able to see everything that goes on. And this is a top-down policy making, which has got some pros, it also has some cons. There is no single magic solution because the Pathology Laboratory Act, although it stops, for example, BOMO and traditional healers and sinseis from prescribing investigations to their patients, it doesn't outlaw traditional medicine, for example, and we still have people coming in with renal failure, kidney failure, as a result of consuming the steroids or the supplements that have been prescribed to them. So the PathLab Act is not a single magic solution to the problem of BOMOS, for example, assuming that's one of the problems that you're trying to fix. The implementation is crucial, but dependent on too many variables. Let me share something with you. It's been 13 years since the Pathology Laboratory Act has been passed, and it still has not really been implemented. 24 years to create a law, 13 years and still no full implementation of the Pathology Laboratory Act. This is the practical reality of policy making. I would like to end with a bit of homework before we do questions and answers here for the next 10 minutes. For next week, and this is Ifa Farzana's idea. Thank you, Ifa. For next week, I'd like you to think of a problem in Malaysia's health system and build a policy based on slide 8. This is slide 8. And in slide 8, the principles, strategies, policies, implementation, you can tell me what the problem is and you can tell me what the causes are. You can also tell me what the unintended consequences are as well. I leave that to you. But what I'd like you to do is think of a problem in Malaysia's health system and build one policy. I don't need a basket of policies. I think in terms of baskets, yeah, because it's important that we have multiple solutions because each problem has got multiple causes and therefore we need multiple solutions. But I'd like you to think of a problem, build a policy based on slide 8. You can do the following: problems to causes to principles and strategies to policies. How are you going to implement, and how will you watch for unintended consequences, or what are some of these unintended consequences? I've already given a few examples to you earlier. This is the, shall we say, homework for next week, and we'll spend about half an hour or so. I would love to have some volunteers. And to encourage volunteers, I'll say the following. You're between the ages of 20 and 25 right now, you're still a medical student. You have the license to make some mistakes. When you become a policymaker, when you're 30, 40, 50 years old, you become a health minister or the director general of the World Health Organization, you're making policies, right? There is very little room to make mistakes. Therefore, my encouragement to you is volunteer your hand and present to us next week and make your mistakes with me, and make your mistakes when you're a medical student, not when the stakes are very high. Make your mistakes when the stakes are very low. I really encourage you to volunteer your comments for next week. Now, I'm going to pause here for a second and ask if anybody has any questions. Sheikh Shamsul, I think you may have to unmute semua orang lah, so that they can speak, or alternatively, you can type your questions into the chat group.
Boleh Doktor, saya unmute semua.
Okay, terima kasih. Marjorie, I note your comment and I'll send a fresh set of slides. But if the links are not there, right, I would encourage all of you to be resourceful and find the links yourself. I will give you the links, but really there's shouldn't be spoon-fed, yeah, everyone? Okay, any questions from anyone about the content that was given over today? It doesn't feel like I rushed through it though. We spent a good 50 minutes giving the framework for health policy making. Go ahead and ask anything.
Hello, Doctor.
Yes.
I'm Nabil. Regarding your previous slide, there's one slide regarding the who, where, what, and when. In this section of who and which level, I can see that the government technocrats and also the NGOs, they already tackle the all level of policies making. So what's the purpose or what's the importance of others who persons? Why don't we just let them decide and make the policies? Because they can already tackle all levels. Thank you, Doctor.
Nabil, a great question. I would love to answer your question, but if it's okay, Nabil, let me take one or two more questions, especially if anybody wants to build on what Nabil has said.
Oh, great.
Thank you, Nabil. It's a great question. Does anybody want to build on what Nabil has said?
Hello.
Hello, yes.
Good morning, Doctor.
Morning. You should go ahead.
I just want to add on some opinions on Nabil's questions. Maybe it's because of we need as much as opinions as possible, so that not everything is decided solely by one or two party, but instead we need to collect as many as opinions and then vote for the best one. Just my 2 cents.
And did you say vote as in undi for the best one?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, go on.
That's my 2 cents.
Okay, thank you. You said I might come back to you a little bit, yeah? Anyone else who wants to build on this question? Or other questions at all? Yishan, thank you. Nabil, can I invite you to maybe we'll try to have a conversation, yeah, between Nabil, Yishan, and I, yeah? Nabil, what do you think of Yishan's idea?
The previous opinion, is it? Or in the chat box? No. Okay.
No, you just tell us right now, please. Verbalize.
regarding Yishan, that we should have a little bit more opinion from other parties, is it?
Yes, and then vote for the best one.
It's quite, it can be berat sebelah, because in our term, if we have that, like we have opposition, we have the government. If they have some misunderstanding, they might be not supporting or voting the best possible policies, but instead they might be voting for their parties, even though the policies are not as good as the other parties. And plus, the government technocrats and military bureaucrats, they already represent the government. So I think shouldn't it be they already represent the government and they can already collect opinion from the government, so from the insider itself. And for the non-governments, they represent, we can so call that they are representing the person or people who are not government. So shouldn't it be enough for them to decide on it?
For technocrats to decide, right? Okay. Thank you. Yishan, anything else you want to respond to that?
I'm still insist on my opinion where we need democracy, and then although yes, government has all those experts, but still we can't obtain the opinion from everyone, like every level of society. So I'm still thinking that it's better for us to as many as parties to involve in the selection.
So Yishan, what I might say to you, is the following, yeah? So let me just return to this one. Yishan, what if, I agree we need more opinions, but to an extent, yeah, because we cannot ask 32 million Malaysians what they think about smoking policy, okay? So at some point we have to say no more opinions, but in general terms, more opinions is better. I also agree with the general idea of a vote for the best one. Although vote for the best one can sometimes be controversial, because should you make decisions by consensus? Should you make decisions by, if it's voting, if it's one round, single round voting or double round voting? And it's very interesting to look at different types of electoral models or election models. Malaysia's one is first past the post, but there are also things like ranked choice voting, majoritarian voting, plurality voting, and so on. And those are all political science tools which we won't discuss. Let me ask you one direct question, Yishan. I agree with your sentiments, yeah? I agree, yeah? My question is, can we have more opinions and vote for the best one, but no opinions from politicians, just more opinions from technocrats?
No, I don't think so.
So you still think politicians need to be there?
Yeah.
Okay, noted. Then if I may, can I ask everyone in the chat group, I can spend another 5 minutes here because I think this is an interesting conversation. I'll end in 5 minutes. Let me ask a new question in the chat group, okay? And there's no right or wrong answer. There's no right or wrong answer. I would say the question is as follows. Who do you trust more? All things being equal, every country in the world, every country in the world, yeah, all things being equal in general terms, who do you trust more to make health policies, assuming it's a binary choice? Politicians or technocrats? Who do you trust more to make health policies, politicians or technocrats? Your answers in the chat group, please. Assuming it's a binary choice. Monica Mange is a very good point over there. Thank you. Okay, most people are saying technocrats, that you trust more. Okay, that's a good answer. I appreciate your answer. We don't have everybody answering though, so go ahead and answer the question here in the chat group. The question is, who do you trust more to make policies, politicians or technocrats? Assuming it's binary, and I'm sorry to make you make it so difficult, yeah? Okay, let me move to the second question, all right? My second question is as follows. Now, you've told me that in general terms, you trust technocrats more. Of course, you know, they're more trained and less vested interest and so on and so forth. That's fine. The second question is tougher. Should politicians remain a part of the decision-making process? The answer is yes, they should. No, they shouldn't. Should politicians remain a part of the health policy making process? Should politicians remain a part of the health policy process? Yes, they should. No, they shouldn't. Question is, should politicians remain a part of the policy-making process? Yes, they should. No, they shouldn't. Great. So most people here in the chat group say that we trust technocrats more than politicians, but politicians should remain in the policy-making process. I think these are great say consensus decisions, yeah, or outcomes of the voting. Let me explain why. For good and for bad, and this requires a political science explanation. For good and for bad, the democracy, representative democracy that we have today is the best way to make decisions for a country today, best way to organize a government that we have today in the year 2020. In the year 2030, 2040, we may have a different model of arranging and organizing our society. And when we get there, that will be good. Now, the question then becomes for us, how do we get the right politicians to be in power? And what sort of roles and decisions do we give to the politicians? And how do we check their power as well? We always talk a lot about politicians, right? But let me say an unintended consequence of giving all the full powers to technocrats is that then the technocrats become too powerful, too unaccountable, and they're also open to problems of bias, just like politicians, because they're human beings after all. They're also open to problems that they're very siloed and they don't really think about the broader things like the fiscal health of a country. Although to Marjorie's point in the chat group, full transparency about the fiscal health or the financial health of our country is not only limited to politicians, but everybody deserves to know. And therefore, technocrats also deserve to know. But technocrats also have one more problem, right? Is that they can be very jealous of their turf. And they're also finally subject to the same issues of accountability, governance, transparency, oversight, even corruption, just like any other politicians as well. And the witness to this is that in recent weeks, right, we've seen a lot of immigration department officials, police officers, and so on who've actually been arrested or investigated, one or the other, because of allegations against them that they've helped illegal migrants or migrants who are undocumented to come into this country illegally. So the point I'm making is that from a political science perspective, this is the best system that we have at the moment, and politicians deserve to be a part of the decision-making process. But just like any other system, we need to find a check and balance for the power of politicians or technocrats or any decision makers. Thank you for the conversation that we've just had. Let me have a look at the chats that have come up, right? And I think there's some great comments over here. Marjorie, you're very right. At 10:59 a.m., it's a very interpersonal, it's a very personal characteristic because you can have a good elected politician and a terrible technocrat and vice versa. So your maturity, expertise, and so on is very important. Manika Mange is also very right. The authorities at state level to be involved in policy making. So one example that I'm fond of that I think hopefully does not take place these days is that at one point, Putrajaya, the Ministry of Transport, was deciding on the route of a public bus in Perlis. I'm not kidding you. In Ara or Kangar or wherever in Perlis, the bus route was decided in Putrajaya. Why? If you're going to implement the policy, I believe you need to have more power to decide what policies should be implemented because you're closer to the front lines. I absolutely agree, Manika Mange. Let's see. Kaishan has got a great point. You trust technocrats more because they know the underlying problem, but you trust the politicians as they need to weigh more other problems. Kaishan, I see your point. Let me give you the counterpoint, right? The counterpoint is that the Directors General of Health, or rather, there was a period in Malaysia's history that we had 2 weeks without any minister and the civil service continued functioning because the Ketua Setiausaha Negara also needs to weigh other problems. And the KSU, so Ketua Setiausaha or the Director General of Health and various other departments also have to weigh other problems, not only within their narrow scope. So it's not just politicians who do that, technocrats are also doing that at the moment. Ting Yun's got a great point about politicians representing the citizens' voice. And Kashvina, they should take into account all the consequences. When you say they, Kashvina, I assume you mean politicians, and that's a good point. However, politicians also need to rather share this information about internal plans and budgets and so on, right, with the technocrats, because ultimately the technocrats will be the ones implementing Rancangan Malaysia Ke-12. So people like you and I, we will stay. Politicians come and go, but the civil service is permanent, and that's a bit of a theory about public administration, which I studied some years ago. Ladies and gentlemen, I really enjoyed the conversation with you today. What I'd like to do is to go back to the request for next week. Think of a problem for you in Malaysia's health system, and from the structure that I've provided to you, build a policy based on slide 8. What is the problem? And then the causes, principles, strategies, and policies, and how to implement it. And if you would like, then you can also tell me the unintended consequences. You can also bring in the landscape, for example, politicians, if you want to make it even more complex. I want the politicians to do this. I want the technocrats to do this. I want the federal level to do this. I want the state government to do that, for example. I'm going to end my lecture over here, but maybe I'll pass the floor a little bit to Nabil. Nabil, you want to say something? Go on.
No, I think it's a great discussion for everyone, and I could see that we have to outweigh everyone, and we have to include everyone in order to get an informed decision. But still, it is a hard part to decide our policies, and as well as who will be the ultimate responsible person to decide who will be responsible on this part, who will be responsible in this part.
For specifically which part?
I mean, who will be deciding on, like, you technocrat, you will be continue with the Rancangan Malaysia, and who are the district officers. You have so who have the power to decide that? I mean, once the person is who responsible for the accountability, I mean, indirectly he is the one, or the group is the one that have the ultimate power.
Nabil, a great question for which I have to answer through the lens of philosophy and political science. Yeah, I'll go with philosophy. Your question is a question of legitimacy, keabsahan. Keabsahan kerajaan, keabsahan perlembagaan, keabsahan the punca kuasa yang diturunkan daripada Putrajaya kepada pegawai daerah. And your question is philosophically a question about legitimacy. But to move on to political science, right, is to say that the punca kuasa comes from the constitution, which then gives you the law. And in the Medical Act, for example, there are more powers to the Director General of Health than to the Minister of Health. There are some powers, Director General and the Minister, and they complement each other. There's also a way to check and balance each other as well. Like if you disagree with the DG, you can always appeal to the Minister, that kind of thing. But at some point, the powers in a country have to end in a pinnacle. And if, for example, you disagree with the DG, for example, you can go to Minister. If you disagree with the Minister, can you go to the Prime Minister? Yes. And after the Prime Minister, where does it end? And usually the point where it ends is either the court, meaning the judiciary of a country, or the executive, the highest executive of a country, President or Prime Minister. That doesn't answer your question. Your question is who decides? The answer is usually consensus decision. And once that decision has been made, it's put into law. And if you disagree with that decision, you can change the law. How can you change the law? By perhaps, Nabil, considering citizens movement, change.org petition, joining an NGO and creating advocacy for that issue, maybe even running for parliament and becoming a minister yourself, or for example, becoming president of a political party or a coalition, and then you change the law, and therefore you can change the way these decisions are made. But I'll describe the very dramatic, very difficult route. Some decisions are very small decisions. They don't even have ever to go to the DG, and therefore you don't even have to go to the political route. Nabil, I hope I answer your question, yeah? I'll answer Kaishan's question, and then I really am very sorry I have to go. Kaishan's question in the chat group is, for the recent ministry statement, it seems that the ministry did not consult third-party opinions and relevant data. What's the underlying problem? Lack of consultation, just superficially, lack of consultation. Again, the one more issue is that you cannot endlessly consult, because there's 32 million Malaysians, 57,000 doctors, all of them have their own opinions. So at some point you have to draw the line, and wherever you draw the line, somebody will be unhappy. So Kaishan, Nabil, Wan Mustazli, and at some point you are going to make a decision, and people will say consult widely. But reality means you have to draw the line, and once you draw the line, eventually somebody is going to be unhappy. Okay, I'm not defending the government, I'm reflecting the reality of it. So the underlying problem is lack of consultation, but there's a problem with endless consultation. Another underlying problem, I would say, is a lack of understanding about the causes of that problem. In this case, a further study of specialists. A third problem is reactivity, meaning the questions were presented to them in Parliament maybe 1 or 2 weeks ago, and then they have 1 or 2 weeks to just come up with a reply, and there are many questions coming at you. On top of that, you have to do your daily work in the Ministry of Health, and you have to do your daily work in the party politics and in your constituency, etc., etc. I'm not making excuses, again, reflecting reality. The point I'm making is that it's reactive. And when it's reactive, it would always then look that it's poorly conceived, poorly thought out, poorly researched, poorly argued, poorly conceived, and therefore they will receive backlashes. So your question is, what's the underlying problem? Lack of consultation and a lot of reactivity. But what's the underlying, that answers your question superficially. And to answer your question more deeply, the underlying problem is, does Malaysia have enough specialists? And you might answer yes or no. And maybe if I go one step back, does Malaysia, whatever number you arrive at, most people will say Malaysia needs more specialists. And I might agree. But the unintended consequence of that, right, is that you have a great strategy. 10 years from now, everybody's a specialist. Nobody's a general practitioner. Nobody's a family practitioner. Nobody does generalist medicine or generalist surgery. So the cough, cold, the simple tuberculosis, simple diabetes, simple appendicectomy, nobody does it because everybody's a super subspecialist already. That is a very massive unintended consequence of a headlong rush into specialist training. So just because we need more specialists doesn't mean that there will not be any unintended consequences as well. Kaishan, I give you these two things to think about. Do we have enough specialists? And frankly, what is the role of specialists in the health system in a country like Malaysia, given we have digital health and we're going into Industrial Revolution 4.0? Is it sustainable? Do we need so many? And things like that are also interesting basic questions to think about. Ladies and gentlemen, I've really enjoyed speaking with all of you today. I hope this was helpful to all of you. I look forward to seeing all of you for 2 hours next week. Yeah, any final thoughts or questions? You all have my email address at the moment. I'll be interested to hear your reflections, right? Any thoughts that you want to share. And if you want to ask me any questions, happy to answer them, but trying to ask me questions, information that you cannot find on the internet. If you can Google this up, Google it up, don't ask me. I mean, be self-reliant is my point. But if there are any questions that require thinking, for example, what am I not thinking about when I think about this? This is something that you are not able to find on the internet, and I would enjoy thinking about these things and talking to you as well, yeah? Thank you very much. I'm so sorry I have to go right now, but we'll be in touch. Bye. Terima kasih, Cik Syamsul, Cik Bukhari.